Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don, Defense Against the Dark Arts Week. And if you regularly follow Midday with Reverend Don, you'll know that we can communicate directly. If you type your question or comment on whatever platform you happen to be watching on, it will show up here in my chat room. And you can take an active part in our conversation. Again, this is Defense Against the Dark Arts Week, and we have been talking about basically how to defend yourself against baneful magic or simply negative energy. And hello to Lynn in the chat room. It's good to see you, Lynn. Today, we're going to talk about defensive items such as defensive amulets, defensive talismans, the use of automata, and so forth, as ways of helping to shield yourself against anything negative that could be an issue. Hello to Rajput in the chat room. And I think that I want to start by, once again, discussing what is meant by negative energy. When I use the term negative energy, I'm not necessarily referring to intentionally baneful energy, though that certainly does count. But it can also just be muddy, unsettled energy, uncharged energy that just gets in the way and gums up the works. So to some extent, when we talk about defending yourself from negativity or cleansing yourself of negativity, we're not exclusively talking about baneful magic and the like. We're also just talking about part of everyday life. It's natural as we go through life that we create and send out and receive energy between ourselves and everything we interact with. And hello to Kazan in the chat room. It's good to see you, Kazan. And some of that energy carries a positive charge. Some of it is negative, which again doesn't mean it's actively baneful, but it does mean that it is damaging to the system, which is why it's important to keep the system clear. Our primary subject this week deals with baneful magic, but we're also just talking about unintentionally negative energy as well. And today, we wanted to talk about amulets and talismans. And as I say, also, we'll talk about automata and the like. And I suppose we need to start with the meaning of the terms amulet and talisman. And this is one of those subjects which really shows how imprecise language can be. I understand an amulet as being a metaphysical item created for a magical purpose, and having been physically created. For example, this medallion could be considered an amulet if charged and used that way. It's a physical creation. A talisman is a found object, such as a stone that you might carry in your pocket. It's not that you can't do anything with a talisman, but at a certain point it will move from being a talisman to an amulet, at least under this definition, because the difference is whether it's in a natural state or has been altered. If you find, for example, a lucky stone, that is a talisman. If you choose a stone and charge it for protection and carry it for that purpose, that's still a talisman. If, on the other hand, you find a ring that you're using for in that same way that you charge for protection and you wear it, that is an amulet because it is made. Now, having said that, there are other people who use exactly the opposite definition. And as to which one of these is accurate, the truth is these words just aren't that strongly defined in general usage. So, hello to Janet in the chat room. For the purposes of this conversation and anything that I am likely to say, an amulet is something that has been created for its metaphysical purpose, and a talisman is in its natural state. A lot of people carry protective talismans or amulets, and they can be very effective. One of the most common, hello to Tom in the chat room, one of the most common talismans is a stone that you might just carry in your pocket. You might put it in a place in your home for the purpose of having a metaphysical effect, and often that effect is protection from negativity. Some of the stones that are good for that, generally speaking, black stones are good for that. Hematite, which is a reflective black stone, is often used for protective purposes, and also because having a mirror-like quality, it reflects negativity back to its origin. These are a couple of examples of natural talismans that you might have. Hagstones, if you're familiar with those, they are natural stones um, which have a natural hole in them, and they're considered very protective, particularly against baneful magic. And people who are lucky enough to find one will often carry it to repel negativity. Um, Amulets work in the same way, except again, they have been created. So Jai Rajput in the chat room asks, can we join that stone with a wand? Yes, absolutely. But then I wouldn't still call it a talisman, although perhaps in and of its own self within the larger construct. But if you've joined it with something, if you've built it into something more than it originally was, it's more along the lines of an amulet, or in the case of a wand, it becomes a tool or part of a tool. Let me see what else I have in my little box here. So this is a gold stone, and the stone itself could be considered a talisman, but it's part of a ring. So you might consider it an amulet. And again, the difference between these words is largely arbitrary. What is a gold stone for? It's for attracting money, it's for attracting prosperity and stability. Now, when we come back to defense against the dark arts, we're talking about things that are particularly for protection, perhaps to help with shielding, perhaps to reflect negativity. And as I say, hematite is particularly useful for reflecting negativity. It's also useful for protection in general. There are a lot of different stones that can be used that way, but not only stones. There are also designs. And again, I'm going to hold up this medallion, the gift of Cosmo Rubiconis. And as you can see, it carries the sacred eye. And in this case, I believe it is the Eye of Ra, but it is a protective amulet. It has been used that way since ancient Egypt. A very ancient sign, which is probably the origin of the so-called evil eye sign. The Eye of Ra represents at one level the sun. It represents the influence of the divine in life. But above all, it's protective. And when people wear it, it's generally to be protective and to draw good things in general. But it's an example of a very traditional design, which you can use as an amulet for protective purposes. I mentioned the so-called evil eye. I don't have one of those around me. But if you go to the Pagan World Auction, you can see some lovely items that display it. And I'm sure that if you've been in this community for any length of time, you've seen it. And it's a very simple design of an eye, usually with a black pupil and a sky blue iris, occasionally a darker blue iris. And it represents protection. It's called the evil eye design because it's often used with the idea of reflecting the so-called evil eye, the idea that that people can send negative energy to you intentionally or unintentionally uh, through the eyes, which is a very strong belief in some parts of the world. It's also used for protection against every other thing you can imagine. And it really, in the end, is the same symbol as um, the Eye of Ra or the Eye of Horus from ancient Egypt. And the difference between the Eye of Ra and the Eye of Horus is that one is the right eye, one is the left eye, but they're both protective um, when used as amulets, just they have slightly different qualities. There are many other things. There are protective runes, there are protective sigils, there are all kinds of different things that can be used this way. You can create your own. You can put it on a medallion, you can write it on a piece of paper, fold it up and carry it in your pocket. Um, these are different things that you can use, and of course you have to charge them. Um, you might notice that I am wearing my Tutankhamun memorial tie pin, um, which I've had for some 30 years, and which is in its own way a protective amulet for me. It depicts the ancient Egyptian pharaoh in the form of one of the busts from his tomb. But what it represents to me is the power of the influence of the divine through the pharaoh as a protective element, not unlike a uraeus. So these are some of the different kinds of amulets you might have. You really could make almost anything into an amulet if you charge it appropriately. Now, in my various books, we talk about how to charge an amulet. I suppose we should probably take a few minutes and talk about that now. And I guess I'll do that before moving on to any other subject. So, let us say you have an amulet you wish to charge, and of course there's more than one way to do this. I'm going to give you a nice simple way that I would think almost anyone can do. So you want to take um, the item that you wish to charge as an amulet, hold it in your hands. Begin by clearing any pre-existing uh, excess energy from it, and you do that just as you would yourself. You wash through it with light, with energy. You take out any negativity. Depending on exactly what it is, you take out all influences. But obviously, if you're using a stone and you want its energy, that energy will remain. But it's the energy of interaction that you're generally trying to get rid of. Now, of course, if it's been given to you by someone and you want to preserve their influence, you will take that into account in how you do this. But you want to remove any negative energy in particular. And I usually do that by visualizing a yellow-white light. And you might have a little incantation with that. I charge all negativity to depart from this amulet and not to return. Something very simple. And then you want to flood it with positive light into which you put your intent for protection. I usually use a blue-white light for that. And I charge you to protect me against all negativity. I charge you to help me to keep strong boundaries, keeping out all that might harm me. By my will, so mote it be. Or something like that. And that's a very simple way to charge a talisman. Now, there are other ways. Some people might like to use the light of the full moon as how they would charge, or part of how they would charge their amulet. Um, some people will have very complex ways of doing this. You can, of course, make the creation and charging of an amulet into something rivaling a Busby Berkeley musical if you wish. And if that's what you need um, to feel that you have done a good job, by all means do that. But it can be just as simple as what I've just shown you also. Nothing in magic really needs to be difficult. It does require resolution, it requires practice, and it requires sticking with it in terms of building the skills that you need. But none of it is inherently difficult any more than learning to walk was difficult. Yes, it had its moments, but the vast majority of us go through this as toddlers and do just fine. Magic really, in its own way, is just as natural a process. You're doing it every day that you're alive, whether you're conscious of it or not. We're just learning to take conscious control of this process. And again, it can be very simple. Now, we've talked a little bit about amulets and talismans, and you can get books full of designs that you can use for amulets. Some of them are very ancient, but they don't need to be. You can also very easily, if you're studying sigil craft, learn to make your own um, using symbols that have meaning to you right now. Um, it's a matter of what you consider to be most effective for your purposes, what interacts best with your interaction with deity and the world. In addition to amulets and talismans, and again, a talisman is a natural item, and generally speaking, we charge it for our purposes, um, but we don't generally make a lot of alterations to it, or really normally any alteration to it. Though to a certain extent you can, but at what point it moves from a talisman to an amulet um, is then a question, though really only a semantic one. But I was also going to talk about automata. An automaton is a magical creation in this sense of the word, which is created and charged to a particular purpose that it then carries forward with no further interaction from the creator. There are lots of ways to create automata for the purpose of protection. Automata can be very useful. For one thing, they're not working, um, they're working automatically, even when you're not paying attention. They don't require your constant monitoring or, to some extent, you're ever monitoring them again. Let me give you a couple of examples of automata. One example of an automata that I think most people will be familiar with is the Tibetan prayer wheel. Um, in a Tibetan prayer wheel, a prayer is written on a piece of paper wrapped around the wheel, which is created in such a way that it turns when you shake it. The idea is that every time the wheel turns, the prayer is sent out into the universe. It's a way of saying the prayer without having to recite it, and they're very widely used. Not only in Tibetan Buddhism, but the same kinds of automata are used in other places. Uh, in a manner of speaking, the inscriptions that you see, particularly on ancient tombstones, serve this same function. If you look at ancient Egypt and some of the funereal items you'll see there, one of the common ones is an offering stela, where the offering of food and provisions for the deceased is depicted visually and often described through words. And the idea is that this will create this automatically going forward as long as this image survives, so that if the living members of the family are no longer living and there's no one left to make offerings to the spirits, it will still happen automatically through these inscriptions and these images. So it's a very ancient idea. But in terms of protection, um, one of the ones that I would strongly recommend are wind chimes. If you take your wind chime and you charge it to be both protective and also to alert you of when there's a need for protection, they can be a very effective way of having a protective automata. When when you hear it, particularly at unusual times, it can be an alert to the fact that you need to pay attention to your other protection. Um, This works on the same idea as, for example, a witch's ball. If you don't know what a witch's ball is, or certain kinds of witches' jars, although that term can have a number of meanings. Uh, it is a ball or jar filled with lots of little diverse objects, often just pieces of thread, on the idea that this will confuse any negative energy trying to enter the home or trying to come to the person. It is an automata that is set up to be protective. Once you've set it up, you don't have to deal with it again. If you've seen reflective garden balls, which are also sometimes called witches' balls, they're the same idea. The mirror image, the mirror finish on the ball is meant to reflect negativity. Once you've set it up, once you've charged it, it will continue to reflect any negativity that is sent from you away from you. That's an example of an automata. You charge it once, you put it in place, it does its work. Now, you can always renew that charge and probably should periodically. But this is what an automata is. Another common automata used for protection is a mirror in the window. You take your mirror, you charge it for protection, you set it facing out through a window, usually right by the entrance to your home. And the idea is it will reflect everything that might be harmful to you. Now, hello to Monica in the chat room. It's good to see you, Monica. Monica says that they have a basket at their front door to collect all the negatives that she does not want in her space. And yes, I do this automatically. I just never thought, why do I do these things? This is why. This is a very traditional thing. And if you just knew to do it, then you were carrying that memory through from another life where you've done it before. And hello to Eve in the chat room. It's good to see you, Eve. And you know, there are people who'll try to tell you that interest in magic and metaphysics is a relatively new thing. This is not the case at all. Obviously, anyone with any knowledge of the history of magic knows it goes back as far as humanity goes back, and has always been here. And the use of automata goes back as far as humanity goes back. There is an interesting cave, I believe in France, and predates modern humans, I believe. And one of the things that distinguishes it is that there were several, I think it predates modern humans. I would have had to have looked this up to be exactly precise, but what is remarkable about it is the presence of a fox skull at the entry to, I believe there were 7 different dwellings. Each one had a fox skull there. This would presumably have been an automata for protection, invoking the spirit of the fox to protect the home. It's something we would do today, although not usually with an actual fox skull, but with a protective automata. And so although we cannot know, we can reasonably assume they were doing something similar. Way back at the very origin of our experience here on this planet. I saw an interesting comment the other day, someone very confidently asserting that scholarship had proven there were no actual witches in Salem, which is absolutely not true, by the way. At least 2 of the people who were accused may very well have been doing some sort of magic, which in the definitions of that time might have been considered witchcraft. Specifically image magic. It was not uncommon. There's no particular reason to think people wouldn't have been doing it, and probably would not have thought anything of it necessarily. But there were definitely people using things we would consider witchcraft at that time, including some of the judges who were practicing alchemy, which today would be considered part of the metaphysical community. Monica says, my family taught me magic. They just never labeled it, as they didn't want others to know what we did. You know, a lot. I'm very glad that you say that. And, you know, the history of magic, a lot of modern historians are trying to eliminate all of these different lines that come down into the modern community. But in fact, there are so many influences, some of whom did label what they were doing, some of whom did not, but all kinds of practices that are living practices that go back a very long way. Um, and Janet says, I would think of this as a burden basket. You leave your burdens in the basket outside your front door so they don't come inside. That would be another good way to do that sort of thing. And these are some of the things that we do with magic that build a better life for ourselves. Whether we're protecting against negative energy we don't want to come in, or leaving negative energy we might be carrying ourselves. Either way, the point is to get rid of the negative energy, which is always a good thing. I mentioned wind chimes as an automata. Another thing that you might consider an automata, some people will have a bowl of salt for the purpose of collecting negative energy, which they would frequently empty, but they might place it in a corner in their home to round up anything negative that might somehow get inside and be floating around. That could be considered an automata because once you've set it up, it continues to work. There are many different things you can do. And when we talk about magic, we're not just talking about, well, we're certainly not talking about Harry Potter types of spells. We're talking about the things we do in everyday life. And people who are magical involve their magic in really everything they do. And that, at least in my mind, you see magic in things that others might miss. Now, Monica says, when my great-grandparents came from Finland to America, very cool, they took a fake name to hide who they were. It was very important to keep who we were very secret. So much so that I didn't know who my family was until 2022 after I did my DNA and found my indigenous family. And that is a very interesting subject, and maybe we should make it a show in its own right. I'm going to take just a moment to comment on it. Many of those families that practiced magic, including my father's family, were very, very secretive. A lot of them held beliefs such as the idea that if you speak about your magic, it will lose its power. The point of which obviously was just to keep it secret. Um, my mother, who was Corellian, came from a very open system and had no trouble talking about things that she did. My father, getting any kind of information out of him was very difficult. I did, but he was very big on this secrecy thing. And of course, the reason why is obvious. It could cause problems. But I think it also caused a lot of things not to be passed on that should have been. I also find it interesting that Monica mentions Finland. I don't have it in front of me, but the athame that I have had since I was 13 years old, and consider my athame, even though I have a number that I use, um, is of Finnish origin, and was given to me by my uncle Edward, who was Finnish. Um, and Monica asked, Finnish Karelian. Well, the Karelians were not Finnish, but we have marital ties that brought in some Finnish practices. And it's a beautiful red-handled athame with a horse's head as part of its imagery. And only many years later did my son inform me that it also has a background as a souvenir from the Finnish Olympics in the mid part of the 20th century. But it's a fairly common design for a Finnish fishing knife. And it was given to me to be my magical knife, and I have used it that way. One of the things about Corellianism is that we adapt everything we connect with. And so, as a familial tradition, whenever someone married into the family, if they brought useful magical practice with them, it became part of Corellian practice. Today, as a global tradition, when people join the tradition, they often bring practices with them which become part of Corellianism, um, at least in certain places. And people in different places do practice Corellianism differently. And I have found that a fascinating thing. And again, we may want to continue this conversation in another program. At this moment, I see that we have come to the end of our half hour. And these are the things I basically have to say about automata and amulets and talismans. And if you think about it, amulets and talismans could be considered automata in their own right. Um, Monica says, yes, often that's why they did marry, to help learn new magic from other tribes. I love hearing that because that's very much what Corellians did and do. And it's always nice to know in a world full of people who want to keep the carrots separate from the peas, that we're not the only ones who like to bring everything together. We always felt the more knowledge you have, the better off you are. The more effective techniques you have, the better off you are. And didn't particularly feel any hesitation to adopt new ideas and have frequently sought them out. And I certainly hope to see that continue as we move progressively into the new generation of Corellianism. And I'm pretty confident that that will be the case. So with that, I want to thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed Defense Against the Dark Arts Week. If you want to hear more about this, let me know, because there certainly is more that I could say. Thank you for all of your comments and conversation, and for joining me in this program. And I appreciate this time with you. I love you all. I look forward to seeing you on Monday. And for now, let us close with our prayer. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us both to set our boundaries and to know our abilities and our limitations, so that we may increase the former and decrease the latter in sensible ways. Help us to adapt those things that work to make our lives and practices better, and help us to see the world as a wonderful adventure. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks. And knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence now and always, and may you now and always be blessed. And I thank you for your presence, and may you now and always be blessed. And I will see you on Monday.